The Mazda 2 is not a cheap car. At over 100,000 ringgit, this might very well be the most expensive B-segment saloon on the market. However, in this video, we're going to explain to you why this car still exists, why it's been given a facelift, and more importantly, why the customers who buy the Mazda 2 love them as much as they do. My name is Aiman Abdullah. This is Malaysian Motoring. This is our review of the 2024 Mazda 2 Saloon. Now, the Mazda 2 has actually been out for a little while now, and this represents the second facelift that we've received in our market. And this is now in line with the Mazda 2 globally, so you can't say that Burmaz is holding out on new models. Now, for the Mazda 2 specifically, the front end has been given a rather significant facelift. While the headlights remain the same and therefore the LED daytime running lights and so on, the grille has seen a very significant change from the facelift prior, where we've lost a lot of chrome and now it's done up mostly in black to make this car look a little bit more sporty. There's also a little red pill here, again to underline this car's slightly more enthusiastic nature rather. Now, we've also lost the chrome garnish on the lower front corners, which replaced the fog lights in the model before that, and now instead we have this sort of downturned mustache. Now, I'm not too sure how I feel about it, but it's kind of grown on me over the last few days, so I think that's not too bad. What's also new for this model here is this color. Now, I can't remember exactly what the color is called, but I have to say it does look rather successful, even though it looks like it's, you know, like a flat grey. It's actually got a very fine metallic fleck over it, which I think looks quite special. Now, down the side, there are very few changes. We've got a new design for the 16-inch alloy wheels, which have this beautiful sort of diamond cut finish contrasting the black paint, which I think looks quite nice. And like I said, down the side, nothing much has changed, which means, unfortunately, we still have this rather strange proportion at the rear. I still maintain the Mazda 2 looks best as a hatchback, and we will be reviewing that model later. But for those of you who do need more rear space, well, this is what you'll just have to put up with. Now, those strange proportions result in this, where the Mazda 2 hatch ends about here, the Mazda 2 Saloon sort of keeps going. Now, these taillights look rather snazzy, but I would have preferred if some of the internals were done in LEDs, especially things like the brake lights and the positioning lights. Now, if you ask me, while the rear end hasn't changed much, the bumper has been reprofiled, and I think it's quite successful in that sort of execution because it does look a little bit less visually bulky. And if you get the Saloon over the hatch, you lose a little bit of red accenting down on the bottom to mirror the little red pill that you saw on the front grille. Now, if you were to open the boot, you will find that the sacrifice you make in style pays dividends back here because this boot is relatively cavernous. While, of course, there are some competitors with larger boots, I will maintain that you can fit all the space or all the crap that you need to back here if you have 4 passengers in the car, or 5 if you don't like the person sitting in the middle. And you can fold the rear seat 60/40, which is better than can be said of the Toyota Vios. There is also a space saver spare wheel in here, just in case you need it. So overall, pretty successful. The successful reprofiling and changes and so on continue into the interior, where I think that this is kind of where this facelifted, again, Mazda 2 really shines. Because when the Mazda 2 first arrived, we thought, okay, this is clearly a driver-focused vehicle. But then they facelifted it and made it feel more plush and upmarket and luxurious, which was a bit strange because, again, this car's character lends itself towards more enthusiastic drivers. So it seems that with this second facelift, Mazda has realized that, okay, let's not try and hide that character anymore, and instead, let's give it everything it needs to shine. And that is very clear in terms of the material choices, because now the seats are done up in this lovely sort of microfiber material with a little bit of faux leather down the side with lots of sort of red accents here, red accents along the seats. You have this lovely microfiber material, again, continuing onto this dash panel, even onto the door cards themselves, where you get more red stitching here, more red stitching here, and more red accents around the aircon vents. All of this, again, lend itself to a slightly more driver-focused cabin, which is more in keeping with the character of the Mazda 2. And of course, being a Mazda, everything in here feels very solidly built. For example, these leather pads around the center console here, they just don't really move that much. For a B-segment saloon, I'm very impressed with the build quality, and again, it sort of gives itself a little bit more legitimacy as it commands its price. Now, the thing about the Mazda 2 is it is a, we'll say, snug vehicle, and so even sat here it does feel like this cockpit sort of cocoons around you, which potentially is exactly what Mazda wanted it to do. So you have this sort of rising belt line towards the front, which then makes you feel like you're really sort of hemmed in, which is nice. And the steering wheel also aids things as well, because in addition to being leather wrapped, you have standard paddle shifters at the rear which have a very nice action to them. Now ahead of you sits a instrument cluster which seems new, but actually we've seen this before, because when the Mazda 2 first arrived, it had this particular instrument cluster where it had the speedometer in the middle with the rev counter on the left and then sort of a multi-info meter on the right. And then with the facelift, when it got more luxurious, they put the rev meter in the middle, which we really liked, but wasn't quite in keeping with the character of the Mazda 2. At least that particular Mazda 2, where they thought that it was supposed to be a luxury car. Now that they've gone back to being sporty, they've put the more sedate meters back. So now the center is back to being a speedometer and your tachometer is on the left. Very strange choice. The other strange choice is we've lost the heads-up display that we got in the previous 2 iterations of the Mazda 2, potentially in exchange for a couple of relatively large tech upgrades. Firstly, we now get cruise control on this car. It's passive cruise control nonetheless, but it's still cruise control. And we now get an upgraded center screen. This is now an inch larger than before, and the graphics have been slightly improved, and the overall overall usability has been improved ever so slightly compared to the previous generation model, which does make it feel, again, a little bit more upmarket. Now, in terms of practicality, we are struggling a little because this is a relatively compact car. So this glove box, for example, seems rather large, but the moment you put the owner's manual and the service book and so on in here, all of that space basically evaporates. You have relatively large door bins here, which can fit this very large bottle, or cup rather, and of course that also does fit in the 2 center cup holders here, but the space in here is not that generous. So if you have your cup here, then good luck reaching the manual handbrake. Now, in terms of buttons and switchgear, of course, with a Mazda, everything feels nice. The buttons on the steering wheel feel nice, the actions of the stalks all feel very positive, and even the climate control knobs feel quite nice. Further down, you get the sole drive mode selector, where you go from normal to sport, because according to Mazda, that's all you really need. And then you have the MZD Connect system down here, where you have a physical volume knob and a physical control knob to manipulate that screen. This is not a touchscreen, which for the most part is okay until you use Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, because then you intuitively want to touch the screen, which does nothing. Aside from that, things in here are pretty much all right. If I were to complain, I would have appreciated maybe a digital cluster for this climate control, because having a knob to try and control your temperature is a bit strange to me, because I don't really know what my temperature is. But aside from that, things in the front at least seem pretty positive. But unfortunately, it's the rear half of the Mazda 2 where things start to fall apart. Because if you're looking at this as a practical B-segment saloon to compete against vehicles like the Honda City and the Toyota Vios, then this is kind of where you'd struggle a little. Because as you can see, with this seat set up in my driving position, I have very little knee room, although headroom is actually surprisingly good for a car this small. And these seats are mounted higher than the seats in front, which means my view is pretty much alright despite this relatively large headrest, and because the seats in front are still mounted quite high, I can tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me. Now, in terms of material quality, things remain quite positive back here at least, where you still have that nice microfiber material here and more of that microfiber material on the seats. However, a lot of the red stitching is gone because there's none on the seat and there's none on the door cards, which is a little bit unfortunate, but it is what it is. The other thing that's unfortunate is that we don't get a rear center armrest where you would normally be able to find cup holders. Unfortunately, all the space you have is sort of here, where in this car we've put a smart tag, because you can divide this space, and then if you remove the divider, it just becomes one large space. You put the divider back, then you have room for that aforementioned smart tag. I'm going to struggle with this a bit, and as well as an additional third cup holder for rear passengers. Stay on the line collar, this is very fiddly. I've put together Lego sets less difficult than this. Anyway, aside from that, the other bonus to buying a Mazda 2 is the fact that, like many other Mazda cars, these cars come with tint, which are very good and would be greatly appreciated if you were to fit a child seat back here, because you don't have sun blinds, as to be expected. But what I do find a bit odd is that given the fact that this car is very compact, with this seat set up like this, you're going to struggle to put in a rear-facing child seat without moving the front seat, although as you can see there is a little bit more space here because the front passenger can obviously stretch their legs out. And of course the door opening itself is not that wide, which means again putting a bulky child seat might be a bit difficult. At least finding the ISOFIX mounts won't be, because they're just these little slits down here. And you know, I guess it's all right. I think I know exactly who the target market is for this car, and I don't think they'd mind so much, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But in order to get there, in order to segue to that, we have to first take this car out for a drive where mercifully it claws many points back. Now the reason I say that is because I think that the Mazda 2, perhaps even over the Mazda MX-5, is the most Mazda car that you can buy. Now under the bonnet you will find a 1.5 litre 4-cylinder Skyactiv G engine with power going to the front wheels via a 6-speed automatic gearbox, which is actually the same setup that you get in a Mazda MX-5. Now in terms of output numbers, this car isn't going to set your heart on fire because it isn't the most powerful car out there. And the thing about Mazdas in general, if you look at the engineering philosophy behind it, you understand that it's never really about winning in terms of top trumps. Instead, it's sort of fidelity in engineering. I'll explain. So the reason why this car works very well with this 1.5 litre is because this car is not very heavy, and neither is that engine. And as a result, you get this beautifully balanced setup, which you can feel from the moment you get behind the wheel. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these seats are nice and sporty, they're nice and grippy, and they're very supportive through the corners, which means even if you drive this car enthusiastically, you shouldn't find yourself falling out of your seat, which cannot be said of some other B-segment saloons out there. And the thing about the Mazda 2 is that because its character is very clearly driven and defined by its target towards enthusiastic drivers, it feels that there's very little compromise in here. So if I were to floor it, you'll realize that yes, while the engine is quite vocal, you'll also notice that it's very rev happy. This car is very keen to rev all the way up to its 6,500 RPM red line, and it does so very freely. And when you do get the revs a little bit further up, that's when you unlock this car's little bit of torque, which is kind of rewarding. And because of that very linear torque curve, it means that the power comes in a very predictable way. What that means is, on a motorway, the Mazda 2 is going to just be alright. It doesn't really have all the firepower in the world for, you know, high-speed overtaking and stuff like that. But because Mazda has also engineered this car to be very refined, you get very little in terms of wind noise and road noise, and because this car's suspension setup also gives it a very confidence-inspiring sort of feel, overall it creates this very steady experience. But it's when the roads get twisty that the Mazda 2's character really shines. That beautifully linear torque curve and that very predictable power delivery means that you can eke out the very best performance out of your car. This is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the best handling cars in the entire B segment. While the Toyota Vios can put a smile on your face and the Honda City is kind of alright, and let's not even talk about the Nissan Almera, the Mazda 2's again, clearly defined focus to excite people who love to drive comes very clear here. The steering wheel is incredibly precise, even though it's not the most communicative thing in the world, although that's to be expected. And because of that suspension setup, body roll is very well managed. There is some, but it is in a very predictable way, which means even for novice drivers will be able to kind of figure out where the car is going, how it's going to shimmy, and so on. Of course, if you push on very hard, you will find the front end will want to wash wide, but again, it does so in a predictable manner, and oversteer is generally a little bit easier to manage for people who are not necessarily the most adept drivers. This, to me, I think is again the Mazda 2's trump card, because yes, there are competitors that are larger, there are competitors that are more practical, there are competitors that are slightly more powerful, but I can say with confidence that there is nothing else out there that drives like a Mazda 2. It's so very well put together, it's so very well engineered for people who love driving. And so when you take that into consideration, that's when you start to understand this car's target market. Because if you were to have a family, for example, then you'd be slightly more concerned by this car's lack of rear sort of accommodation for passengers, as well as its relative lack of active safety features, because despite the facelift, the Mazda 2 still does not come with blind spot monitoring or autonomous emergency braking. It has a collision warning system, but that's about it. And so if you were to want to ferry your family about, you'd want a car with slightly more comprehensive ADAS systems in order to keep everyone safe, particularly over longer drives and so on and so forth. Whereas the Mazda 2 has none of those things. And again, when you take into account that this car is relatively small, you begin to understand that this is not a car designed for young families. B-segment saloons tend to be sort of a starter car for people who are just married or just starting a family and so on, because they want a car that's economical, that's affordable to buy, affordable to drive, easy to maintain, and also spacious enough for them to put their families in the back. The Mazda 2 is not really that kind of car, because even for adult passengers, you are going to struggle, as you saw with me earlier, to put someone of average height behind an average height driver. This is for either a single driver, someone who is unmarried or with no sort of family commitments, as it were, who really wanted a car to express their love of driving, or for empty nesters who also feel the same way, because again, this car is incredibly well built, it's very refined, it's very well put together, and I do think that if you have no real demand for rear seat space or an exceptional amount of rear seat space, then this car does make a lot of sense. I wouldn't go so far as to say this is the best B-segment saloon out there, because again, vehicles like the Toyota Vios and the Honda City do put up a pretty good fight. But if you're looking for the best driving B-segment saloon, then the Mazda 2 is it. You'll have to forgive its lack of practicality, you'll have to forgive its lack of active safety features, and you'll have to forgive its slightly strange proportions around the rear three-quarter. But like I said, if you love driving, then nothing comes quite close to the Mazda 2. That said, however, if you want something that is fun to drive while still being able to put adult passengers in the rear, then you may want to consider the Toyota Vios. And of course, if you're spending a lot of time in town, doing town driving and stuff like that, then you may want to consider the Honda City, especially in hybrid form, because that is a very frugal car to run. But if you want a car that again looks towards driving fun as its core objective, then the Mazda 2 is pretty much it. This car is so much fun, and we hope to be able to kind of get that on camera when we get the hatch real soon. Hopefully that review will take a slightly different format. But in any case, that's been our review of the 2024 Mazda 2 Saloon. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.